the church insists that, yeah, that's exactly what parents are called to do. The church uses the phrase that parents are the primary, in other words, the first educators of their children, and not just the first in order, but the first in influence, the first in prominence, and that they have a task there that is really, it's inalienable. They can't give it away and it can't be taken from them.
Hello, and welcome back to HLI Ireland's Let's Talk 2023. This is the weekly show that looks at all things life, faith and family through a Catholic lens. I'm your host, Lisa O'Hare, and every time I get back into this seat, it surprises me that here I am again after a busy week of parenting and all sorts, as you can imagine, busy family life. Here I am, back with you again, and I'm privileged to be here. So as I explained last week, we are going to cover a theme each month, and last week we had Mairead Bernal sharing her testimony on sex education in schools, her experience and her response to it. I hope that it filled you full of encouragement and insight, and that, well, here you are back again for more. So this week I am delighted to welcome Father Chris Hayden. Father Chris is the author, or at least Christopher Hayden. We'll have to ask him if he prefers Chris or Christopher, but he's the author of this book, A Better Vision, Understanding, Living and Sharing the Catholic Vision for Human Sexuality. It's a really, really excellent read. Father Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's good to be with you. And yeah, Father Chris is fine. Christopher is kind of for the formality of the book cover. But yeah, the short version is good. Yeah.
Well, it's really is. Thank you so much for giving us your time, Father Chris. I know you're a busy man, but this is a very, very important topic this whole month that we're looking at. And I wanted just to begin by asking you first why you felt compelled to write this book, A Better Vision. I mean, can you just give us a little bit of the background as to why you took this project on?
Sure, happily. I think I put it in the foreword, actually. So it's somewhere in there near the beginning of the book. Over the years, now and again, a parent would ask me, Father, would you ever say something? I'll try and get my teenagers to Mass. And I remember one lady saying to me, will you say something about, just the whole area of sexuality and what's good and what's not and why? And she said, her phrase was, she said, it's a predatory world they're in. And she was quite clear in her own mind that her children needed guidance, and she didn't feel entirely able to do it on her own. She was a widow, so this particular person I'm remembering. But there've been other instances where parents just asking me to address certain things, and I was never asked to address. There's a whole raft of things I wasn't asked to address, but this specific thing just came back, the whole area of sexuality, sex education. And eventually I just thought to myself, no, I can't resist anymore. I may say something, or I'll feel a bit pestered, or I'll feel I'm letting myself down. And then there was a growing sense, and you don't need to be reading tons of stuff to have a sense. In recent years, there's been a bit of a sea change in how sexuality is. Like, we know the sexual revolution started in the late 60s. But something happened recently. There's an intensity, the whole issue of, what is sexuality? What does it mean to be a sexual being? We debate the whole thing of gender, male, female, what all that means, what it's about, endlessly. So I thought there was a need for something, and I just felt that it was a good thing to do with. And then I had a sabbatical, and I gave pretty much gave the sabbatical to doing it. It started as a series of homilies. And the homilies were kind of shut down by a certain virus a couple of years ago. And then I ended up on sabbatical. And so that's how the book kind of began to come together.
Wow. That reminds me of the theology of the body. Didn't it begin as a series of homilies? And what a fantastic work it was from St. John Paul. So, Father, we looked at Mairead's experience last week, and we know that everyone has many stories to share about their children and what they're exposed to. But we want to really find out what the Church teaches, first and foremost, about education as a whole, and then, what is a parent's role as the educator of their children. Can you share a little bit about your wisdom and what the Church's wisdom indeed is on all of that?
Well, the first thing is that the Church insists that, yeah, that's exactly what parents are called to do. The Church uses the phrase that parents are the primary, in other words, the first educators of their children, and not just the first in order, but the first in influence, the first in prominence, and that they have a task there that is really, it's inalienable. they can't give it away and it can't be taken from them. That all things being equal, there can be circumstances where parents, for various reasons, are not able to bring up their own children, even. But that's a relatively rare thing, thanks be to God. But in the main, in general, parents are the primary educators of their children. They have a role, and it's up to the church then to try and equip parents with the wisdom of our faith. And that's really part of what this book is about as well. There's a lovely phrase in one of St. Paul's letters where he talks about equipping the saints, kitting them out, so they're able to get out into this world, roll up their sleeves, and do what the Lord is calling us to do. And that's really what the book is, a modest attempt to equip the saints.
Fantastic. Yeah, and I think you mentioned something in the book that, when we get married, as part of our vows, is a promise, a promise of the graces that we'll need to educate our children.
Yeah, that's Pope John Paul, St. John Paul. He spelled that out very clearly in one place, and I mention it. I'm just having a look at a page in the book here, and he says that he reminds parents, he said, look, when you bring a child into the world, you've been entrusted with a child of God, a brother or a sister of Christ. And, he's not idealizing the task of parenting. That's not what he was about. But he's making the point that the Lord's assistance is there in all the joys and sorrows, the highs and lows of it. And the parents are commissioned, he says. They're commissioned for the task of education on the day of their marriage. When they answer that question, are you willing to accept with love the children God may send you and bring them up in accordance with the law of Christ in his church? That's a commission as well. That's being sent forth. If the Lord blesses you with children, you're taking on that task of educating them. And you take it on the day you were married.
Wow. I mean, and it was another phrase that, I think it was page 23 of the book. Look, I've done my homework. And it says that, the demands are a blessing, even if they seem like a burden. So, and that the sacrifice and the self-restraint and the good that we have, that we're given, that needs to be shared with our children. And, the whole idea of education, I know we're focusing on sex education, but just taking a step back, you mentioned in your book as well, I know the church teaches that we're there to form the hearts and minds of our children. Maria touched on that last week as well. And this is a really broad sense of teaching them who God is and who they are and what their identity is as a child of God. And that's first and foremost, because we're starting with infants and we show them the love of God by the care that we take of them. But we're very well aware then that education as a child grows up, and indeed as we know what's being thrust upon them, there's a different ideology going on that's counteracting what, the formation that we want for our children's hearts and minds. And you mentioned it in the book that if we don't address it, if we leave a void or a vacuum, that someone else and someone else's ideologies will come in and fill that vacuum.
The children's minds and hearts will be formed. End of story. There's no room for debate about that. Your children's minds and hearts are being formed. The question is how, and by whom, and according to what values, and according to what vision of the human person, according to what vision of flourishing. What are we for? What's our ultimate good? What are even our more proximate, more this worldly goods? How do we work? What makes us tick? What damages us? And I like the idea that we're not just forming minds, we're forming minds and hearts together. Because if we just talk about forming minds, it's a little bit like we're pouring information in there. But we are shaping young lives, shaping minds and hearts, and we're shaping behaviors, and we're bringing people up. For instance, and I'm sure we'll get to it in a little, but if you bring a child up and your take on sex education is that it's not that sex and love simply don't go together. That's a vehicle for satisfaction and pleasure in the present moment. It doesn't go any further than that. That shapes a mind and a heart in a particular way. If you bring your children up repeatedly, telling them that, no, sex is something very precious and it's a vehicle, it's an instrument of love, it's the body language of love and commitment, then you're shaping minds and hearts in a very different way. But to go back to the point, I think it's worth repeating. The minds and hearts will be shaped. There's no room for doubt about that. It's who and how, and according to what values, according to what vision, according to what sense of what is good for the human person. And we have a very clear understanding of that. And that's why I gave the book the title, A Better Vision, because we have a vision of humanity, we have a vision of sexuality, so does everybody else. but we happen to believe, as people have been blessed with some of the gift of faith, we happen to believe that it's a very good vision and it's worth sharing and it's worth bringing our children up in, no matter what the cost or how difficult it is to do or how misunderstood it is to do. That's not. We'd rather it was otherwise, but let's get on with it and put our shoulder to the wheel and give it our level best.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, you spoke off camera about 5 principles. Can you share with us, a little bit? I know, I mean, I would, as I said before, I would highly recommend the book. But just in the brief time that we have, could you go through those? Is it the 5 principles of educating your children in this area?
What I did was, again, I was the teachings of the church are extraordinarily rich, whether it's Pope Francis or going back through Pope Francis and Pope John Paul. It's not that Pope Benedict didn't have anything to say on the matter, but in terms of quotable, solid stuff for this particular area, John Paul, of course, is the master with the theology of the body, and Pope Francis, I think we'll see maybe over the next little bit, maybe perhaps in the next what do you call podcast, that he has some particularly arresting things to say. But there, in one of his documents on the family, there is a chapter that is extraordinarily rich. And when I was pondering it, I thought to myself, I need to do a bit of work to distill out of this some really fantastic knockout principles for education. And I divided them into 2. I don't know if we've time to go through. Do you want the 5 principle first, or the 4 principles? Because there are 4 principles, and I've called them principles of motivation. But okay, the 5 principles of content. Will we start with the principles of content and see how we get on?
Let's go for it. Let's go for it. Let's see what we get through. Come, Holy Spirit. Let our listeners hear what they need to hear right now.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Okay, so now that's the principle. Right. First, content. Like, what should be in there? We can talk endlessly about sex education and how important it is to do it well and respect people and all of that. They're fine. But content is important. I'd nearly, to borrow a phrase from the real estate business, it's not location, and location. It's content, and content. There's context as well and motivation, but let's focus on content here. The first content principle is that sex education cannot be given without reference to values. You can't abstract this from values. A value-free approach to sex education, it actually trivializes sex. It's also at odds with sound psychology, because there's too much of the person involved in human sexuality for it to be simply removed from value, from what it is that makes us flourish, from what's for our good. And they're all value questions we can't get away from. A lot of contemporary theorists and educators, they kind of, I would say, caricature concerns as fear-based. We have to be fact-based rather than fear-based or ethos-based. But beware when we hear people decrying ethos, saying that this is fact-based rather than ethos-based. Very, very often what they're saying is it's fact-based rather than value-based. Now, values are facts as well. They're not as demonstrable as, let's say, biological or medical facts, but in the longer term, we see what happens very clearly when we lose a value, kind of a compass. So sex education as a first principle of content. Ask, if somebody is engaged in sex education, ask them, what values are you trying to instill in children? And if they tell you they're value-free, you need to press them on that. How can you be value-free? What do you think my child's life and well-being is of value? Oh, of course I do. So are you trying to do something with my child and trying to impart something that will foster that value, that excellent value of a child's mind and heart? The answer to that, of course, has to be yes. So we can't get away from the value issue. Will I jump along to the second?
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, people will take these away and really reflect on them themselves, I hope so. No, yeah, keep going.
Okay. There's a second principle of content is that, and it's very closely related to the value issue. Sex education, it must be given in such a way that it enables children to learn and to respect moral norms. Now, I know this is bad language for people who see it some other way, who see it in a value-free way. But at the same time, sometimes the very same voices can be tremendously moralistic, almost in a
Yeah.
nitpicking sense, telling the world, especially those who are slaves to ethos, if you'll pardon the slight note of cynicism. People can be really quite picky about their values. We all have values, we all have value systems. But sex education, it can't, it should be given, it must be given in a way that enables children to know and to respect moral norms. And as we'll see, those moral norms are something bigger than just consent and hygiene. There are moral norms, they're much more personal, and they're about human flourishing, and they're about respect, they're about dignity. I mean, for instance, if if gratification and pleasure and self-expression are being taught in school as the fundamental principles to guide a child's choices, we have to be, you as parents have to be, we as clergy have to be trying to help people to counter that with the insistence that sex is about more than these things. It's about vastly more. For sure, it includes gratification and pleasure, but in a context as an expression of a free, faithful, fruitful, permanent commitment of love, which is marriage. And that's another story again, I'm sure we'll get to. And it's a
Yep.
very sound and very, very clear teaching. Anything less than that is a disservice because it's just that, it's less. Why give less when we can give more? So, and we can also make the point here that the Christian vision, it actually values sex more rather than less than the secular alternative.
Yeah.
Okay, how about a third one? How are we for time at the moment, Lisa?
Good. Well, we have probably about another 5 or 6 minutes. How do you think?
I will go along here at full tilt. So, right, a third one. Um, where have I got? Okay, um, sex education. It's because sexuality is, as we all know, if we give it a moment's thought, it's very deep. It's very personal. Um, it must take full account of human personhood and dignity. And that brings us to a third content principle, that sex education should be provided in a way that is, as I say, fully personal and that respects the dignity of the human person. There's something more going on than just the mechanics, just the plumbing, just being given clear knowledge. Sometimes the voices on that we would be competing with, they're conveying the impression that children need to know. It's almost like they need to know the facts of life, like they don't. Now, what they need to know, in tandem with the obvious external facts, they need to know what they are for, what they themselves, as human beings, as sexual human beings, are for, because we know the evidence is well in. It's all about us. We know that the disordered use, to put it that way, of sex, it tends to lessen a person's capacity to enter on a lifelong commitment of love. It doesn't necessarily mean that everyone who's ever been sexually irresponsible is doomed to be unable to love, not at all. But it tends progressively, the word progressively is important there, because if we stay on that trajectory, it becomes more and more difficult for us to take ourselves off it and to become committed as sexual, loving, committed human beings. And to respect the personal realities, to make sure that sex doesn't get depersonalized. Um,
That whole idea, yeah, and that whole idea of dignity takes, I mean, multiple levels, because there's the dignity of the child, and you've mentioned it in the book, and Marie had mentioned it last week, that latency phase, the dignity of allowing children to be children, first and foremost, and that's not being respected by such proposal and by what's going on. But there's also then the dignity of the person in the act, the dignity of the person that you're engaged with. There seems to be, and you mentioned it again in the book, the height of the education that's being offered, their moral values seem to be all around hygiene and consent. And it's such a low bar when that comes to the dignity of another person. It's such a low bar. And what the church is trying to teach us is to raise that bar, to raise the bar of the dignity of ourselves and the dignity of the person that we are, that we're in relationship with, if we're even in relationship with.
Indeed, yeah, to respect a person as person. And the thing about being a human person is we don't get used.
Yeah.
We defile people as persons when we use them, whether it's sexually or any other way. We don't just use
Yeah.
people because they have an inherent, innate dignity. Will I give the last two rapid fire?
Yes, please. Yes,
Sex
please.
education, and this is so crucial, and it's so simple as well. And I think we have believers. It's clear, but I think people have a strong enough intuition of it, irrespective of beliefs or religion. Sex education. There must be some element of uh, education in love as self-giving. There has to, and that's really another clear content principle that parents should bear in mind, because um, a sex education program that focuses on just on exploration, on self-expression, gratification, maximization of pleasure, and that does not consider self-gift. Self-gift requires self-possession, of course. If it doesn't require self-possession and self-gift and all that entails, it isn't merely defective, it's untruthful. It's flat out wrong and untruthful. And it doesn't form young people, it deforms them. Because our sexuality is it's part of our orientation towards other people, towards deep self-giving, even sacrificial relationship. So when all we talk about is exploration, self-expression, gratification, maximization of pleasure, we're losing all of that, and that's untruthful, and it can deform rather than form. And the very last one, fifth content principle, sex education. For that reason, it must be education in chastity. Now, chastity is a misunderstood word. It's not the same thing as celibacy. Okay? We are all called to chastity, be we married, single, engaged, whatever. We're called to chastity in virtue of our baptism. And to be chaste, chastity is the virtue of temperance as applied to sexuality. It's ownership, it's self-possession. The focus of chastity is self-possession, self-mastery, self-control. And the working assumption of a fair bit of the secular sex education thinking is that those things are maybe not quite possible, or not desirable in any case, because they're repressive, uh, and that we need to be working against that, because chastity is a beautiful thing and we are all called to it. And as to emphasize again, it's not universally the same thing as abstinence. It's about self-possession in the matter of sexuality. Let me finish on that with just a quote from Pope Francis. The language of the body calls for a patient apprenticeship in learning to interpret and channel desires in view of authentic self-giving. But who, and he goes on to say, but who speaks of these things today? Who is capable of taking young people seriously? Who helps them to prepare seriously for a great and generous love? Where sex education is concerned, much is at stake. That's Pope Francis.
Wow, thank you so much, Father. I mean, even that line, "Who is capable?" I think, for my generation, a lot of my generation have not been handed on or have not been equipped, and we can look back into that and why that is the case. And what would you say to parents who feel either ill-equipped to educate their children, or parents who have maybe made mistakes themselves in the past, or who feel like they're not able to stand over what the church has taught because they didn't know it, didn't believe it, or didn't practice it in their own past? Have you any advice, or have you come across parents who have that fear?
I'd say to anyone in any context where, if you feel you have a whole skeleton, a cupboard full of skeletons, look, that's God's mercy deals with them. That doesn't stop you doing your best now with your children in your context. So it's not about being morally qualified, okay? Uh, it's not about being morally qualified, it's about being morally obliged. Okay, there is a solemn obligation on us to leave no stone unturned to instill what is authentically human, which is also what is authentically Christian, into children, so that they have good guidance, so they don't get lost in this world and live broken and unhappy lives rather than whole and together lives. That's the task here. So don't worry about skeletons in the cupboard. A couple of very practical things. Okay, first of all, parents, realize you are the primary educators of your children. Organize together with others, associate, network in as well as you can. Maybe enlist the help of your parish, your diocese. A lot of priests feel singularly ill prepared for all of this, and I get that. But you have, as Catholic parents, you are entitled to the help of your parish and your diocese, and encourage your priest. Don't round on him. Don't say, when. Invite him to get on board. Could I be really naughty and suggest you give him a gift of a certain book, even, whatever it might be. But network as well. Realize that you have a wonderful task, and go for it. But don't be held captive by a few skeletons in the cupboard.
Thank you so much, Father. I feel like we've really raced through this, and in a way, maybe we have, because this is just an absolute ocean of information. But it's a beautiful calling to all of us. It's a beautiful commission, as you said, and we want, just maybe this is a taster for you, our viewers, to go back and learn more. Go to the heart of the church. She has the wisdom. She is an educator. She is our mother. And she wants to share her information about the beauty and the dignity of the human person, about sexuality, about marriage, chastity, all of these things that really are so important to the development, the healthy, beautiful development of our children. So, Father Hayden, thank you so much for today.
You're very welcome, Lisa. Thank you.
So just to let our viewers know, Father Chris will be back again in a few months. I know that you're looking forward to some of the other topics that we're going to be covering. We're looking at marriage. We're going to look at some of chastity challenges. We're also going to look at homosexuality and gender identity. So keep in touch. Let us know what your feedback is. Like, share and subscribe. You don't want to miss Father Chris again. And we'll put some more information about his book on our show notes. So thank you for your time today. Please remember that we at HLI Ireland are working and praying for an Ireland where God is first, life is sacred, and the family is cherished. Until next week, God bless.